A little girl named Layla noticed an elderly man, Mr. Thompson, sitting alone at a restaurant, celebrating his birthday. Feeling a sense of compassion, Layla decided to join him, turning what could have been a sad evening into a heartwarming moment. What Layla didn't know was that her simple act of kindness would spark a chain of events with unexpected outcomes. How did Layla's kindness change the situation? And what surprising turn of events would follow? Stick around to find out. But before we dive into the full story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartwarming tales like this, don't forget to subscribe. As the sun set, its warm colors painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Layla and her dad, James, walked hand in hand down their familiar street. They were headed to Mama Rosa's, their favorite cozy family restaurant where they ate every Friday night. The smell of fresh bread and tomato sauce filled the air, making Layla's stomach growl in anticipation. "Daddy, do you think Mama Rosa made her special garlic knots today?" Layla asked, her big brown eyes full of excitement. James smiled and gently squeezed her hand. "I hope so, sweet pea. You know they're my favorite, too." As they neared the restaurant, the lively sounds of people talking and laughing spilled out onto the street. The wooden sign above the door swayed slightly in the breeze, welcoming them inside. "Good evening, James." "Hello there, little Miss Layla." Mama Rosa greeted them warmly as they walked in. Her round face was flushed from the kitchen heat, and her apron was dusted with flour. "Your usual table is waiting," she said with a smile. Layla's face lit up. "Hi, Mama Rosa. Did you make the garlic knots today?" "Of course I did. I know my two favorite customers can't resist them," Mama Rosa replied with a wink as she led them to their usual corner booth. The restaurant was buzzing with life. Families laughed over plates of pasta, couples whispered quietly to each other over candlelit tables, and the soft clinking of forks and knives created a soothing background noise. Layla slid into her seat, her legs swinging happily beneath the table as she took in the familiar scene. James sat across from her, his face softening with a smile as he watched his daughter. "So, how was school today, Layla? Did you learn anything interesting?" he asked. Layla's face brightened. "Oh yes, we learned about butterflies, Daddy. Did you know that they start off as caterpillars and go into a cocoon before becoming butterflies? It's like magic." As Layla excitedly shared her day, James caught sight of something at the far end of the restaurant. An older man had just been seated by the window. He wore a neat but slightly worn tweed jacket, his white hair carefully combed. What caught James' attention was the man's expression. He seemed tired, and maybe a little sad, sitting alone in the lively restaurant. Layla noticed her father's distraction and followed his gaze. "Daddy, why does that man look so sad?" she asked. James turned back to her, surprised by her awareness. "I don't know, sweetie. Sometimes people feel lonely, especially when they get older." As they continued their meal, Mama Rosa approached the old man's table. "Mr. Thompson, it's so good to see you again." "Happy birthday," she said, placing a small cupcake with a single candle in front of him. Layla's ears perked up at the mention of a birthday. She watched as Mr. Thompson smiled softly, though it didn't seem to reach his eyes. "Daddy," Layla whispered, her voice full of concern. "Why is Mr. Thompson alone on his birthday? Doesn't he have family or friends to celebrate with?" James sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Well, honey, sometimes as people get older, they lose touch with family or friends. Or maybe they don't have anyone left to celebrate with. It can be a lonely time for some people." Layla's forehead creased as she tried to understand. She watched as Mr. Thompson blew out his birthday candle with a gentle puff, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of being alone was too much to carry. "But, Daddy, no one should be alone on their birthday," Layla said, her voice filled with determination. "Can we go say hello to him? Maybe we can sing him a birthday song." James hesitated, not wanting to intrude on the man's privacy. but seeing the genuine care in his daughter's eyes, he couldn't help but feel proud of her. "That's very sweet of you, Layla. Why don't we ask Mama Rosa if it's okay first?" Layla nodded eagerly, and James waved Mama Rosa over to their table. After a quick explanation, Mama Rosa's eyes filled with emotion. "Oh, bless your hearts," she said. "Mr. Thompson has been coming here for years. He's a sweet old soul, and I'm sure he'd love the company." With Mama Rosa's approval, Layla slipped out of the booth, smoothing down her favorite yellow dress, and James followed close behind as they walked to Mr. Thompson's table. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson," James said softly. The elderly man looked up, surprise flashing in his faded blue eyes. "I hope we're not interrupting, but my daughter, Layla, heard it was your birthday and wanted to wish you well," James continued. Mr. Thompson's weathered face softened into a real smile as he looked at Layla. "Well, hello there, young lady. That's very kind of you." Feeling a bit shy, Layla stepped forward. "Happy birthday, Mr. Thompson. I hope you don't mind, but I thought you might like some company to celebrate." The old man's eyes widened in surprise, clearly touched by the offer. I would like that very much, actually. Thank you." James pulled out a chair for Layla, and she climbed onto it, her feet swinging just above the floor. Layla's curiosity got the best of her as she leaned in and asked, "How old are you today, Mr. Thompson?" Mr. Thompson chuckled, though it sounded like he hadn't laughed in a long time. "I'm 75 today, believe it or not." Layla's eyes grew wide in amazement. "Wow, that's a lot of birthdays. What kind of cake do you like best?" As Mr. Thompson began to answer, James observed the elderly man with surprise. He seemed to come alive in front of his eyes, the tiredness slowly lifting from his face. A spark of joy appeared, one that hadn't been there before. "Well, when I was a boy, my mother used to make the best chocolate cake with vanilla frosting," Mr. Thompson recalled with a distant look in his eyes. "I haven't had a cake like that in years." "Chocolate cake is my favorite, too," Layla exclaimed, her face lighting up. "Daddy makes me one every year for my birthday, right, Daddy?" James nodded, smiling at the heartwarming exchange. "That's right, sweet pea. Maybe next year we'll make an extra one for Mr. Thompson." The conversation flowed smoothly after that. Layla's innocent questions brought out story after story from Mr. Thompson's life. He told her about growing up in a small town, the adventures he had as a young man, and his career as a teacher. With each memory he shared, the years seemed to fall away from him, making him look younger by the minute. As they chatted, Mama Rosa approached the table with a smile. In her hands was a small chocolate cake with a single candle on top. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Thompson," she said warmly, "but I overheard your conversation. We always keep a chocolate cake on hand, just in case." Mr. Thompson's eyes misted over as Mama Rosa set the cake down in front of him. "Oh my, I don't know what to say," he whispered, visibly moved by the gesture. "Make a wish, Mr. Thompson." Layla clapped her hands, her excitement contagious. The elderly man closed his eyes for a brief moment before blowing out the candle with surprising force. A cheer erupted from their little group, and soon the other diners in the restaurant joined in, creating a ripple of joy throughout the room. Mama Rosa cut slices of the cake for everyone, sharing the happiness even further. Mr. Thompson turned to Layla with a twinkle in his eye. "You know, young lady, this is the best birthday I've had in a long time. Thank you for your kindness." Layla grinned, her chin smeared with chocolate frosting. "You're welcome, Mr. Thompson. No one should be alone on their birthday." James watched the scene with a heart full of pride and emotion. He was amazed by how his daughter's simple gesture had turned a lonely evening into a celebration of life, friendship, and connection. As the night came to a close, Mr. Thompson shook James's hand warmly. "You have a remarkable daughter, sir. Her compassion is a rare gift." James smiled and put his hand on Layla's shoulder. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." Happy birthday again." As they left the restaurant, with Layla's small hand safely in his, James couldn't help but feel that they had all received something special that evening. It was a reminder of how much a small act of kindness could mean and the impact it could have on others. Little did they know, this chance encounter was the beginning of something much bigger. For now, though, as they walked home under the twinkling stars, everything felt right. They were warmed by the glow of a new friendship formed in the cozy atmosphere of Mama Rosa's. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains of their cozy apartment. It was a Saturday, and Layla sat cross-legged on the living-room floor, surrounded by coloring books and crayons. James was in the kitchen, making pancakes, and the smell of breakfast filled the air. It was their favorite time of the week, a simple, peaceful Saturday morning together. "Daddy, can we go to the park later?" Layla called out, her crayon moving back and forth across her coloring book. "I want to see if the ducklings have hatched yet." James chuckled as he flipped a pancake. "Sure thing, sweet pea. How about we pack a picnic and spend the whole day there? How does that sound?" Layla's face lit up with excitement. "Yes, please. Can we bring extra bread for the ducks?" "Of course," James replied, setting the last pancake on the plate. "Now come eat before your breakfast gets cold." Layla scrambled to her feet and ran over to the table. But before she could sit down, there was a sharp knock at the door. James, not expecting any visitors, furrowed his brow. He wiped his hands on a towel and walked over to the door. "Coming," he called, unlocking the deadbolt. As the door swung open, James found himself face to face with two police officers. One was a tall man with a serious expression, and the other was a shorter woman whose kind eyes contrasted with her crisp uniform. "Good morning, sir," the male officer spoke in a deep, authoritative voice. "I'm Officer Johnson, and this is my partner, Officer Chen." "Are you James Wilson?" James nodded, feeling a knot of worry form in his stomach. "Yes, that's me. Is everything okay?" Officer Chen stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Mr. Wilson, we're here to speak with your daughter, Layla." "Is she home?" James' heart raced. His protective instincts kicked in immediately. "What is this about? Layla's only 8 years old." "We understand your concern, Mr. Wilson," Officer Johnson replied. "We're investigating a situation involving an elderly gentleman your daughter interacted with last night at the restaurant. We just need to ask her a few questions." James' mind raced back to the previous evening at Mama Rosa's and the kind old man they had met. Layla was still processing the conversation when she asked in a small, shaky voice, "Daddy, who's at the door?" Her curiosity mingled with the hint of nervousness in her tone. She peeked around James' leg, her wide eyes growing even larger when she saw the two officers standing there. James placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sweetie, these officers just want to talk to you about Mr. Thompson, the nice man we met at dinner last night." "Is that okay?" Layla, now much quieter and a bit uncertain, nodded. Her earlier excitement had completely faded, replaced by a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Why don't we all sit in the living room?" James suggested, guiding the officers inside. He led Layla to the couch, sitting down next to her protectively, while the officers took their seats in the armchairs nearby. Officer Chen leaned forward, her voice soft and calming. "Layla, we heard you did something very kind last night. You kept Mr. Thompson company on his birthday. Can you tell us about that?" Layla glanced at her dad, who gave her an encouraging nod. She took a deep breath before speaking, trying to recall everything clearly. "We were at Mama Rosa's, like we are every Friday. I saw Mr. Thompson sitting all alone. Mama Rosa gave him a cupcake because it was his birthday. He looked really sad, so I asked Daddy if we could go say hello." As Layla spoke, Officer Johnson quietly took notes, scribbling down everything in his small notepad. James kept a close eye on the scene, his arm draped protectively over Layla's shoulders. "That was very thoughtful of you, Layla," Officer Chen smiled. "Can you tell us more about your conversation with Mr. Thompson? Did he say anything that seemed strange or make him upset?" Layla furrowed her brow as she tried to remember. "Not really. He told me stories about when he was young and about being a teacher. Oh, and he loved the chocolate cake Mama Rosa brought. He said it was just like the one his mom used to make." Officer Johnson looked up from his notes. Did Mr. Thompson mention any family or friends? Anyone he was planning to see after dinner? Layla shook her head. "No, he didn't talk about any family. He just said he hadn't had a birthday like that in a long time." As the questioning continued, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, his concern got the better of him, and he spoke up. "Officers, I appreciate your thoroughness, but could you please tell us what's going on? Has something happened to Mr. Thompson?" The officers exchanged a quick glance before Officer Chen sighed and spoke. "Mr. Wilson, I'm afraid Mr. Thompson was found unresponsive in his home late last night. The paramedics couldn't revive him." A heavy silence fell over the room. It felt like the air had been sucked right out of James' lungs. Beside him, Layla's eyes filled with tears. "You mean Mr. Thompson died?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Officer Chen nodded, her expression somber. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm very sorry." Layla turned and buried her face in James' side, her small shoulders shaking as she began to sob quietly. James held her close, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I don't understand," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "He seemed fine last night. A bit lonely maybe, but not sick." Officer Johnson cleared his throat before explaining, "That's part of what we're trying to figure out, Mr. Wilson. Since you and your daughter were likely the last people to interact with Mr. Thompson, we needed to gather as much information as possible." As Layla's sobs subsided, she looked up at the officers, her eyes red and swollen. "Did we do something wrong? Did we make him sick?" "Oh no, sweetheart," Officer Chen quickly reassured her. "You didn't do anything wrong. In fact, from what you've told us, you gave Mr. Thompson a wonderful last evening. You should be proud of your kindness." James hugged Layla tighter, feeling a mix of pride in her compassion and deep sadness over Mr. Thompson's death. "Is there anything else you need from us?" James asked, eager to comfort his daughter in private. Officer Johnson stood, tucking his notepad away. "No, Mr. Wilson, you've both been very helpful. We'll be in touch if we need anything else." As James walked the officers to the door, Officer Chen turned back, offering a small smile. "Mr. Wilson, I know this must be difficult, but remember that your daughter's kindness made a real difference in Mr. Thompson's final hours. That's something to hold on to." With a final nod, the officers left, leaving James and Layla to process the shocking news. James returned to the couch and gently gathered Layla into his arms again. "Daddy," Layla sniffled, "why did Mr. Thompson have to die?" "He was so nice." James stroked her hair softly. "Sometimes, sweetie, it's just someone's time to go. But you know what? You made Mr. Thompson's last birthday special. You made him happy, and that's something wonderful." They sat there together, the pancakes in the kitchen now cold and forgotten, as James reflected on how quickly life could change. Just yesterday, they had celebrated a stranger's birthday, and now they were mourning his passing. The rest of the morning blurred by as James called his sister, Angela, to tell her what had happened. Angela offered to come over to help with Layla, but James politely declined, thinking that he and Layla needed some quiet time together to process everything. By early afternoon, news of the police visit had already spread through the tight-knit neighborhood. James' phone constantly pinged with messages and social media notifications, the news traveling faster than he had expected. As James prepared a light lunch, there was a knock on the door. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Gonzalez. Her round face was filled with concern as she entered. "Oh, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I just heard about what happened. How are you and little Layla doing?" James gave her a weak smile. "We're okay, Mrs. Gonzalez. It's been a shock, but we're managing." Mrs. Gonzalez nodded sympathetically. "The whole neighborhood is talking about it. Some people are worried, but most of us, well, we think what Layla did was beautiful. She has such a kind heart." As if on cue, Layla came out of her room, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. Mrs. Gonzalez immediately wrapped her in a warm hug. "There's my brave girl," Mrs. Gonzalez said, her voice soothing. "What you did for Mr. Thompson was a true mitzvah, a blessing." Layla looked up, her eyes still puffy from crying. "Really? But he still died, Mrs. Gonzalez." The older woman cupped Layla's face gently. "Yes, sweetie, but he died knowing there was still kindness in the world. That's a gift you gave him." As Mrs. Gonzalez spoke to Layla, James' phone buzzed again with a new message. It was from Tom, another neighbor, when they heard a familiar voice calling out from behind them, "James! Layla!" It was Tom, their neighbor from down the hall, jogging to catch up with them. "Hey, I've been meaning to tell you something," Tom said, slightly out of breath as he approached. The community decided to do something special in honor of Mr. Thompson. James raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Really? What did you all come up with?" Tom smiled, a little warmth creeping into his eyes. "We thought it might be nice to dedicate a small section of the community garden to him. You know, as a memorial. A few of us figured it would be a meaningful way to honor his memory, especially after what Layla did for him. We want to plant some flowers and maybe even add a bench with his name on it." James felt a surge of gratitude and pride. "That's a beautiful idea, Tom. I know Layla and I would love to be part of that." Layla, who had been listening closely, tugged at James' sleeve, her eyes bright with excitement. "Daddy, can we plant the flowers tomorrow? I want to help." James smiled down at his daughter. "Of course, sweet pea. We'll go together." Tom clapped James on the shoulder. "Glad to hear it. We'll start gathering folks tomorrow around noon. Bring whatever you like to plant." As they continued their walk home, Layla chattered on about what kind of flowers they should plant. "I think we should plant sunflowers," she said decisively. "Mr. Thompson would have liked those, don't you think?" James chuckled. "Sunflowers sound perfect, Layla." When they arrived home, the house was filled with the same comforting routine as usual: homework, dinner, and winding down for bed. But there was a subtle change in the air, a feeling that something special was taking shape. The next day, as promised, James and Layla made their way to the community garden, a packet of sunflower seeds in hand. They were greeted by their neighbors, who had already begun planting. The air was filled with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil and the sound of quiet conversation. Tom waved them over to a small patch of ground where a few people were working. "Here's a good spot for your sunflowers." Layla knelt down, carefully planting each seed with the kind of attention only a child can muster. James knelt beside her, helping her press the seeds into the soil. The other neighbors worked around them, each contributing their own flowers and plants to the memorial. As they finished planting, James looked around at the scene. The community had truly come together, not just for Mr. Thompson, but for each other. What had started as a simple act of kindness from Layla had blossomed into something much bigger, an opportunity for everyone to reflect on the importance of human connection. After the planting was done, Tom stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. "I think Mr. Thompson would be happy to see this," he said quietly, glancing at the small garden now full of new life. James nodded in agreement. "He would." Layla stood up, dusting off her hands and looking proudly at the patch of earth where her sunflowers would soon grow. "This is for you, Mr. Thompson," she whispered softly, as if the gentle breeze might carry her words to him. Later that evening, after tucking Layla into bed, James sat on the couch, reflecting on the past few days. It amazed him how much a single moment of kindness could ripple out, affecting so many lives. Layla had shown the community, and him, that even the smallest gestures could make a difference. As the days passed, the community garden became a quiet place of remembrance, where neighbors could stop by, sit on the bench dedicated to Mr. Thompson, and reflect. And every time James and Layla visited, they would see the sunflowers growing taller, a constant reminder of the power of compassion. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of Mr. Thompson, and the lessons he had unknowingly left behind, remained. Layla continued to talk about him, sometimes asking her father questions about life and loss that surprised him with their depth. James did his best to answer, always reminding her of the kindness she had shown and the happiness she had brought into Mr. Thompson's final hours. One day, as they passed the community garden on their way home from school, Layla paused in front of the growing sunflowers. "Daddy," she said, looking up at him, "I think we should always be kind to people, even if we don't know them. You never know when someone might need it." James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You're absolutely right, sweet pea. That's the most important thing we can do." And as they continued walking home, James knew that Layla's simple act of kindness had done more than just brighten one man's birthday. It had created a lasting ripple that would carry forward, touching lives in ways they might never even realize. James smiled at his daughter, deeply touched by her innocence. "Sweet pea, sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that make the biggest difference. You may not think you did anything special, but to Mr. Thompson, it meant the world." Later that afternoon, James and Layla met with Mr. Goldstein, the lawyer representing Mr. Thompson's estate. The meeting took place in a modest office not far from their home. As they sat across from Mr. Goldstein, the weight of the situation began to sink in. Mr. Goldstein greeted them warmly, then opened a file on his desk. "Mr. Thompson was a very private man," he began, "but he left specific instructions regarding his estate. He felt it was important to honor the people who made a difference in his life, especially in his later years. And, as you know, Layla, your kindness during his last birthday had a profound impact on him." Layla fidgeted in her seat, unsure of what to say. James gave her a reassuring nod, encouraging her to listen carefully. "Mr. Thompson wanted to express his gratitude in a tangible way," Mr. Goldstein continued. "He has left a substantial sum of money in a trust for Layla, which is to be used for her education and future endeavors. He believed that your kindness and compassion were qualities that should be nurtured, and he hoped this would help you grow into someone who could continue spreading that kindness." James sat back, stunned by what he was hearing. "A trust fund?" he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "For Layla?" "Yes," Mr. Goldstein confirmed. "Additionally, Mr. Thompson left a donation in your name to a charity focused on children's education, which was something he was passionate about. He wanted your family to be part of continuing the work he valued." Layla blinked, her young mind trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. "But I didn't do anything special," she said quietly. "I just wanted Mr. Thompson to be happy on his birthday." Mr. Goldstein smiled gently. "That's exactly why he wanted to thank you, Layla. What you did was very special to him. Sometimes, the greatest gifts we give are those that come from the heart, without expecting anything in return." James, still processing the news, reached over and took Layla's hand. "You see, sweet pea, your kindness really did make a difference." As the meeting concluded, Mr. Goldstein handed James the necessary paperwork to set up the trust and finalize the donation. "If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out." Mr. Thompson wanted to ensure this was handled with care. After leaving the office, James and Layla walked home in a comfortable silence. The weight of the day had been heavy, but there was a sense of warmth and peace that accompanied it. Layla, still a bit confused, finally spoke up. "Daddy, does this mean I'm supposed to help more people now?" James smiled, looking down at his daughter. "I think it means that you already know how important it is to be kind, and Mr. Thompson wanted to remind you to keep being yourself." Layla seemed to think about this for a moment, then nodded. "I like helping people. Maybe I can help even more now." James wrapped an arm around her as they walked, feeling immense pride. "I have no doubt you will, sweet pea." That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Layla was quieter than usual, her mind clearly still on everything that had happened. After a few moments, she looked up at James with her wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, do you think Mr. Thompson is happy now, up in heaven with his family?" James smiled gently, his heart full. "I think he's very happy, Layla. And I think he's watching over you, feeling grateful for the kindness you showed him." Layla nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. "I hope he knows that I'll never forget him." James reached over and stroked her hair. "I'm sure he does, sweet pea. And I know he's proud of you, just like I am." As they finished their meal, there was a sense of closure, not just to the day, but to the whirlwind of events that had started with a simple birthday dinner. Layla had made an impact that reached far beyond what she could have imagined. And in return, she had been reminded of the incredible power of a single act of kindness. Life returned to its usual rhythm in the days and weeks that followed, but something had shifted. Layla continued to carry the lessons she had learned from Mr. Thompson, always mindful of the importance of being kind to others, no matter how small the gesture might seem. And as the sunflowers they planted in the community garden grew tall and bright, James and Layla often visited the spot, remembering the man who had touched their lives in such an unexpected way. Each time they saw the sunflowers swaying in the breeze, they were reminded that kindness has a way of blossoming into something far greater than anyone could ever anticipate. The memory of Mr. Thompson would forever live on in their hearts, and his legacy, one of compassion, generosity, and love, would continue to inspire them and their community. For years to come. We could go on a little trip, just the two of us. Layla's eyes lit up with excitement, her face breaking into a wide grin. "Really, Daddy? Where would we go?" James chuckled, pleased by her enthusiasm. "Well, I was thinking we could visit somewhere special. Maybe go to a place where we can relax, have some fun, and spend time together. What do you think?" Layla clapped her hands, her joy infectious. "Yes. Can we go to the beach? I've always wanted to see the ocean." James smiled, nodding. "The beach sounds perfect, sweet pea. We'll make it happen." As they began to plan their trip, James reflected on how much had changed since Mr. Thompson's passing. Life had brought unexpected blessings, and the sense of security that came with the trust fund allowed him to focus more on spending time with his daughter. The constant struggle to make ends meet, which had once been a daily concern, now felt like a distant memory. For the first time in a long while, James could breathe easy and think about their future with a sense of optimism. Later that day, after breakfast, James sat down to finalize the trip plans. While he researched flights and accommodations, Layla sat nearby, drawing pictures of their upcoming beach adventure. She was full of ideas: sandcastles, swimming, seashells, and picnics by the shore. "Daddy, can we bring our memory box on the trip?" Layla asked, her voice serious as she added another colorful butterfly to her drawing. "I want to put something from the beach in it, like a seashell, so we can remember the fun we had." James looked up from his laptop, feeling a deep sense of pride in his daughter. "That's a wonderful idea, sweet pea. We'll make sure to find the perfect seashell for the memory box." As they continued planning, James couldn't help but think back to Mr. Thompson's letter and how his small act of generosity had not only eased their financial burdens but also inspired a new way of living, one filled with intention, gratitude, and, above all, kindness. Layla's compassion had sparked a series of events that touched not only their lives but the entire community. The weeks leading up to their trip flew by, and soon enough, James and Layla found themselves standing on the warm, sandy beach, the sound of crashing waves filling the air. Layla's laughter echoed as she ran toward the water, her feet sinking into the soft sand with each step. James watched her with a smile, his heart swelling with happiness. They spent their days building sandcastles, collecting seashells, and playing in the waves. Layla's carefree joy was contagious, and for James, it was a much-needed reminder of how precious these moments were. On their last day at the beach, as they watched the sun set over the ocean, Layla turned to her father, holding a smooth white seashell in her hand. "Daddy, this is the one," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "This seashell is for our memory box. It's for Mr. Thompson, too, so we can always remember him." James took the seashell from her, his throat tight with emotion. "It's perfect, Layla. Just like the kindness you showed him." As they walked back to their hotel, hand in hand, James felt a deep sense of peace. Life had changed in ways he couldn't have predicted, but through it all, the lessons of compassion, love, and connection remained at the center of everything. Layla's simple act of kindness had started a ripple effect that would continue to touch lives for years to come. When they returned home, Layla carefully placed the seashell in their memory box, alongside the cookie recipe from Mrs. Gonzalez and other small mementos from their shared experiences. Each item was a reminder of the power of kindness, and how one small gesture could lead to something much bigger. As the months went on, James and Layla continued to honor Mr. Thompson's memory by participating in the community activities inspired by their story. They visited the Thompson-Wilson Fountain of Kindness often, where Layla loved to sit and watch the water sparkle in the sunlight. Each time they passed the fountain, Layla would remind her father of the lesson Mr. Thompson had taught them. Kindness had the power to change the world. And as they stood there, side by side, James knew that no matter what challenges life brought their way, they would always carry with them the memory of Mr. Thompson and the reminder that, in the end, the simplest acts of compassion were the ones that left the greatest mark. Layla turned to face the gathered crowd, her voice steady yet soft. "Before we finish planting this tree, I wanted to say something about Mr. Thompson. He loved the old oak tree here, and he loved helping people, especially kids. I think he would have liked knowing that something new is growing in the park because of him." She opened the small envelope and pulled out a handwritten note. "I wrote this for Mr. Thompson, and I want to bury it under the tree so it'll always be a part of it as it grows." James felt a lump form in his throat as Layla knelt down and carefully placed the note into the soil beside the young sapling. The crowd watched in respectful silence, many of them moved by the simple, heartfelt gesture. Once the note was placed, the park's worker began to cover the roots with dirt, completing the planting. Afterward, the mayor, who had also attended, stepped forward and addressed the group. "This tree is more than just a symbol of growth. It's a reminder of how one person's kindness can touch the lives of many." Layla's act of compassion, inspired by Mr. Thompson, has created ripples that have spread throughout our community, bringing people together in a way we haven't seen in years. Thank you, Layla, for reminding us all of the power of kindness. Layla beamed, her face glowing with a mixture of pride and humility. James squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with love and admiration for his daughter. As the crowd began to disperse, friends and neighbors approached to congratulate Layla and express their support. Mr. Goldstein patted her on the back, saying, "Mr. Thompson would be so proud of you, Layla. This tree will stand for generations, and people will always remember what you've done here today." Officer Chin and Officer Johnson stood nearby, both smiling. "You've done something truly special here, Layla," Officer Johnson said. "And it's just the beginning." Layla nodded, her eyes bright with excitement and purpose. "I want to keep helping people, just like Mr. Thompson did." Later that day, as James and Layla walked home, Layla's thoughts seemed to linger on the day's events. "Daddy," she said, looking up at him, "do you think the tree will grow really big?" James smiled, squeezing her hand. "I think it's going to grow strong and tall, just like you, sweet pea." Layla grinned. "I hope so. I want it to be big enough for kids to play under and maybe even read like Mr. Thompson did." As they arrived home, Layla seemed to have a new sense of purpose. She was no longer the little girl who had once felt uncertain about her place in the world. Through her kindness and the connections she had made, Layla had become a beacon of compassion in her community. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Layla and James continued to work on their community projects, organizing food drives, visiting seniors, and helping out at school events. Their friendly visitor program grew rapidly, with more people wanting to get involved after hearing Layla's story. One evening, as they sat together over dinner, Layla looked up from her plate with a thoughtful expression. "Daddy, do you think we could do something even bigger to help people? Like maybe start a foundation, like Mr. Thompson did?" James set down his fork, surprised by the depth of her question. "A foundation?" "Yeah," Layla nodded. "We could help even more people that way. Like, maybe we could raise money for kids who need school supplies or for people who are lonely, like Mr. Thompson was." James felt a swell of pride. "That's a big idea, Sweet Pea. But if that's something you really want to do, we can definitely explore it." Layla's face lit up. "I really want to. I think it's what Mr. Thompson would have wanted too." And so, the seed of a new idea was planted. With the support of their community, James and Layla began laying the groundwork for the Thompson-Wilson Foundation, dedicated to spreading kindness and compassion to those in need. It was a way to honor Mr. Thompson's memory and ensure that his legacy lived on through the acts of kindness that had started it all. As the foundation grew, so did the reach of its impact. What began as a small act of kindness in a neighborhood restaurant had blossomed into a movement that touched lives far beyond their own community. And through it all, James knew that the real gift wasn't the trust fund or the financial security. It was the time he had spent with Layla, watching her grow into a young woman who understood the power of compassion. Years later, as the Thompson-Wilson Foundation continued to thrive, the oak tree in the park stood tall, its branches providing shade for children playing beneath it, just as Layla had hoped. And every time James passed by, he would think of Mr. Thompson, the quiet man whose life had changed theirs in ways they could never have imagined. Layla, now a teenager, often visited the tree, sitting beneath its branches with her friends or helping organize events for the foundation. And every once in a while, she would glance up at the leaves rustling in the wind and smile, knowing that kindness, like the tree, had the power to grow and spread, touching lives in ways no one could predict. Layla stood at the podium, her voice clear and steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'd like to read something," she said, holding a letter she had written for the occasion. The crowd quieted, all eyes on the young girl as she unfolded the paper. "Dear Mr. Thompson," Layla began, her voice filled with emotion, "we're planting this tree for you today. Daddy says trees are like people. They start small, but with love and care, they grow big and strong. Your kindness was like a seed, Mr. Thompson. It started small when you shared your birthday with me, but it has grown into something much bigger, touching so many people's lives. I promise to take care of this tree and watch it grow, and I promise to keep spreading kindness, just like you did. Thank you for teaching me that even small acts of kindness can change the world. Love, Layla." As Layla finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. James stepped forward, helping Layla place the letter in the soil beside the young sapling before they both filled in the earth around it. Once the tree was planted, people began to disperse, many stopping to hug Layla or shake James's hand. The atmosphere was filled with a quiet reverence for the moment they had all shared. As the crowd thinned, James and Layla found themselves standing alone by the newly planted tree. "How do you feel, Sweet Pea?" James asked, wrapping his arm around Layla's shoulders. Layla leaned into him, her eyes still fixed on the small tree. "Happy," she said softly, "and a little sad, but mostly happy. Do you think the tree will grow as big as the old oak tree someday?" James smiled, looking over at the towering oak nearby. "With time and care, I'm sure it will. And every time we visit, we'll remember Mr. Thompson and the lessons he taught us." As they stood together in silence, a group of children from Layla's class came running by, calling out to her. "Layla, come play with us," one of them shouted. Layla glanced up at James with a questioning look. He nodded, smiling. "Go ahead, have fun. I'll be right here." Layla ran off to join her friends, her laughter ringing out across the park. James watched her with a mixture of pride and wonder. In the months since Mr. Thompson's passing, Layla had grown in ways that amazed him. She had always been compassionate, but now there was a deeper understanding in her, a sense of how her actions could truly make a difference in the world. James looked at the newly planted sapling, then up at the majestic oak tree that had been Mr. Thompson's favorite spot. He thought about the cycles of life, how endings led to new beginnings, and how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, touching more lives than anyone could have imagined. Watching Layla play, James felt a profound sense of gratitude for everything Mr. Thompson had given them, not just in money, but in wisdom and love. As the afternoon wore on, James noticed Layla interacting with a shy boy who stood alone near the swings. With just a smile and a few kind words, she brought him into the game, and soon they were laughing together. It was a small moment, one that might have gone unnoticed in the past, but now James saw it for what it was, another seed of kindness being planted. Later, as the sun began to set and it was time to head home, Layla ran back to the tree. She knelt down beside it, her small hand gently touching one of its leaves. "Grow big and strong," she whispered. "We'll come back and visit you. I promise." As they walked hand in hand toward home, Layla looked up at her father. "Daddy," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I think I want to be a teacher when I grow up, like Mr. Thompson. I want to help kids learn and be kind to each other." James felt his heart swell with pride. "That's a wonderful goal, sweet pea. I think you'd make an amazing teacher. And maybe," Layla continued, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, "we can start a kindness club at school. We could do projects to help people and teach other kids how important it is to be nice, even if someone seems different or lonely." James smiled at her boundless energy and creativity. "That's an excellent idea, Layla. Why don't we talk to your principal about it next week?" When they reached their apartment building, Mrs. Gonzalez was outside watering the flowers in the garden. "Ah, there are my favorite neighbors," she called out cheerfully. "How was the tree planting?" Layla ran over and gave Mrs. Gonzalez a hug. "It was beautiful, Mrs. Gonzalez. And guess what? We're going to start a kindness club at school." As Layla excitedly shared her plans, James stood back, watching the interaction with a warm smile. He thought about how far they had come since that fateful night at Mama Rose's when they first met Mr. Thompson. His final act of generosity had not only changed their lives, but was now spreading kindness throughout the community in ways no one could have predicted. That night, as James tucked Layla into bed, she asked a question that made him pause. "Daddy, do you think we'll ever forget Mr. Thompson?" James sat on the edge of her bed, considering his answer. "No, sweetie, I don't think we will. Not as long as we keep living by the lessons he taught us. Every time we're kind to someone, every time we help someone in need, we're remembering Mr. Thompson." Layla nodded, her eyes heavy with sleep. "I'm glad," she murmured. "I want to keep making him proud." As James turned out the light and closed Layla's door, he felt a deep sense of peace. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities and opportunities to make a difference. And while the path ahead might not always be easy, he knew that with Layla by his side, spreading kindness and compassion wherever she went, it would always be meaningful. He walked to the living room window and looked out at the twinkling city lights. Somewhere out there, people's lives would be touched by the kindness Layla was spreading, just as theirs had been touched by Mr. Thompson's generosity. It was a beautiful thought, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all people and the power of simple acts of compassion. As James turned away from the window, his eyes landed on a framed photo on the bookshelf. It was a picture of Layla and Mr. Thompson from that unforgettable night at Mama Rose's, both smiling widely at the camera. Beside the photo stood a small potted plant, a cutting from the oak sapling they had planted in the park, which Layla had insisted on nurturing at home. James touched the leaves of the plant gently, marveling at how much life could grow from such a small beginning. It was a perfect metaphor for their journey. What had started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a new way of living, a new understanding of what truly mattered in life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to spread kindness and make a difference. And thanks to Mr. Thompson and Layla, James knew they were ready for whatever lay ahead and parked the car in front of their apartment building. The weight of the day settled on him. The silence in the car was heavy, and the absence of Layla's voice made the place feel strangely empty. He sat there for a few moments, staring out at the building, thinking about how quickly the years had passed and how much had changed since that fateful day when they first met Mr. Thompson. As James stepped out of the car, Mrs. Gonzalez waved from her window, still looking out for her favorite neighbors. He smiled and waved back, grateful for the familiar faces and the sense of community that had grown over the years. Inside the apartment, the quiet was even more palpable. Layla's absence was felt everywhere. Her laughter, her presence, the life she brought to every corner of their home. James glanced over at the framed photo of Layla and Mr. Thompson on the shelf and the small cutting from the oak tree that now sat by the window. The plant had grown quite a bit over the years, its leaves a vibrant green. It was a living symbol of the kindness that had set everything in motion. He walked over to the window, touching the leaves gently, and felt a sense of peace wash over him. The journey had not been easy, but it had been meaningful in ways he never could have imagined. Mr. Thompson's gift had been more than just financial. It had transformed their lives, opened doors to new opportunities, and, most importantly, planted the seeds of compassion and kindness that would continue to grow. As the days passed, James adjusted to the new quiet at home. He threw himself into work and the community projects Layla had left behind. The Friendly Visitors program continued to thrive, and the Weekend Backpack program had expanded to reach more families in need. Layla kept true to her promise, calling often to share stories of college life, new friendships, and the impact she hoped to make as she pursued her dream of becoming a teacher and social worker. One evening, about a month after dropping Layla off at college, James received a call from her. "Dad," she said excitedly, "I've started a kindness club here on campus, just like at my high school. We're organizing our first event next week, and we've already had a lot of students sign up." James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's incredible, sweet pea. I'm so proud of you." Layla laughed, the joy evident in her voice. "I'm just trying to keep spreading the kindness, Dad, like Mr. Thompson taught us." James nodded, though she couldn't see him. "You're doing just that, Layla. You're making a difference, just like he hoped you would." After they hung up, James sat back, reflecting on how far they had come. Layla had taken the lessons of kindness and made them her own, carrying Mr. Thompson's legacy with her wherever she went. It was a beautiful continuation of the ripple effect that had begun all those years ago with a simple birthday dinner. As he prepared for bed, James took one last look at the framed photo and the small oak plant by the window. The leaves rustled slightly in the evening breeze, and for a moment James could almost feel Mr. Thompson's presence, his quiet, enduring kindness still making a difference, still touching lives through Layla. With a deep sense of gratitude, James turned off the light and headed to bed, comforted by the knowledge that the path he and Layla were on was one of love, compassion, and endless possibilities. The future was bright, illuminated by the enduring light of Mr. Thompson's final gift, not just the financial security, but the lasting lesson of how small acts of kindness could change the world. And for now, that was enough. James was struck by how different everything felt. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but without Layla by his side, the world seemed a little dimmer. As he parked the car outside their building, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered near the entrance. Mrs. Gonzalez, Mr. Ramirez, and a few others, their faces expectant. "How did it go?" Mrs. Gonzalez asked the moment James stepped out of the car. "Is our Layla all settled in?" James nodded, touched by their concern. "She's all moved in. Her roommate seems nice, and she's already made a few friends." The group listened intently as James recounted the day's events, their expressions filled with pride and a touch of sadness. It was clear that Layla's departure was felt not just by James, but by the entire community she had touched over the years. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, James found himself walking toward the park. His feet seemed to carry him there automatically, to the oak tree they had planted in Mr. Thompson's memory. The tree stood tall and strong now, its leaves rustling gently in the evening breeze. James sat on a nearby bench, his eyes fixed on the tree. "Well, Mr. Thompson," he said softly, "Layla's off to college. She's going to study education and social work. She says she wants to make a career out of helping others and spreading kindness." He paused, feeling a little foolish for talking to a tree, but somehow comforted by the act. "I wish you could see her now. She's grown into such an amazing young woman, and it's all because of you, really. That one act of kindness you showed us, it changed everything." As James sat there, lost in thought, he barely noticed the figure approaching until Officer Chin sat down beside him. "Thought I might find you here," she said gently. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not rough, exactly, just emotional. Layla's been the center of my world for so long. It's hard to imagine daily life without her around." Officer Chin nodded, understanding. "It's a big change, for sure. But you know, James, you should be incredibly proud, not just of Layla, but of yourself, too. You've raised a remarkable young woman." "I had help," James said, gesturing toward the oak tree. "Mr. Thompson's legacy, it shaped both of us in ways I'm still discovering." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. Finally, Officer Chin spoke again. "You know, James, I've been thinking. The programs Layla started, the friendly visitors, the weekend backpacks, the kindness clubs, they're going to need someone to keep them going now that she's away at college." James turned to her, eyebrows raised. "What are you suggesting?" Officer Chin smiled. "Well, you've got all this free time now, and you've been right there beside Layla all these years, learning and growing just like she has. Why don't you take over? Keep Mr. Thompson's legacy alive right here in the community." James blinked, surprised by the suggestion, but immediately intrigued by the possibility. He thought about the fulfillment he'd found in recent years, working alongside Layla on her various projects. The idea of continuing that work, of keeping the spark of kindness burning brightly in their community, filled him with a sense of purpose. "You know what?" he said slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "I think I'd like that. I think I'd like that a lot." As they stood to leave, James cast one last look at the oak tree in the fading light. He could almost imagine Mr. Thompson standing there, nodding approvingly at this new chapter in their lives. Walking back to the apartment building, James felt a renewed sense of energy and purpose. Yes, Layla was embarking on her own journey now, but that didn't mean the work they'd started together had to end. In fact, this could be an opportunity to expand their efforts, to touch even more lives with the simple yet profound power of kindness. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, James's mind was already buzzing with ideas. He'd call the school tomorrow about continuing the kindness club. Maybe he could work with the local senior center to recruit more friendly visitors. And he needed to touch base with the food bank about the weekend backpack program. Entering the quiet apartment, James was struck by Layla's absence, but instead of the melancholy he'd expected, he felt a quiet determination. His daughter was out in the world now, spreading kindness and making a difference on a larger stage. And here at home, he would continue the work they'd started together, nurturing the seeds of compassion that Mr. Thompson had planted all those years ago. As he got ready for bed, James's gaze fell on the framed photo of Layla and Mr. Thompson from that fateful night at Mama Rose's. He smiled, touching the frame gently. "Don't worry, Mr. Thompson," he said softly. "We're still here, still spreading kindness, still changing the world one small act at a time. And we always will be." With that, James turned out the light, ready to face the new chapter that awaited him in the morning. The house might be quieter now, but the legacy of kindness that had transformed their lives would continue to resonate, touching countless lives in ways they might never fully know. What would you have done if you were in Layla's position and saw an old and lonely man celebrating his birthday by himself? Would you have reached out, or would you have hesitated? Asterisk. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put a lot of time and effort into crafting these impactful narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.